Darkcast Network, indie podcasts with a dark side.
Today's episode contains descriptions of graphic situations, including starvation, violence, and cannibalism. Listener discretion is advised. A more shocking scene cannot be imagined than that witnessed by the party of men who went to the relief of the unfortunate immigrants in the California mountains. The bones of those who had died and been devoured by the miserable ones that still survived were lying around their tents and cabins. Bodies of men, women, and children, with half the flesh torn from them, lay on every side. A woman sat by the body of her husband, who had just died, eating out his tongue. The heart she had already taken out, broiled, and eaten. The daughter was seen eating the flesh of the father, the mother that of her children, children that of father and mother. The emaciated, wild, and ghastly appearance of the survivors added to the horror of the scene. Language cannot describe the awful change that a few weeks of dire suffering had wrought in the minds of these wretched and pitiable beings. Those who but 1 month before would have shuddered and sickened at the thought of eating human flesh, or of killing their companions and relatives to preserve their own lives, now looked upon the opportunity by these acts afforded them of escaping the most dreadful of deaths as a providential interference in their behalf. Calculations were coldly made as they sat gloomily around their gloomy campfires for the next and succeeding meals. Various expedients were devised to prevent the dreadful crime of murder, but they finally resolved to kill those who had the least claims to no longer exist. Just at this moment, however, as if by divine interpolation, some of them died, which afforded the rest temporary relief. Some sunk into the arms of death, cursing God for their miserable fate, while the last whisperings of others were prayers and songs of praise to the Almighty. Published Saturday, April 10th, 1847, The California Star of San Francisco, California. Sup, creeps, and welcome to Creepy Confidential. Is Mothman really a supernatural force predicting impending doom? Did Apollo 11 really land on the moon in 1969? Did you find out if that was a cult that was living just 2 doors down that you waved to every single day when you got your mail? If these are the things you ponder when you should be sleeping, then I would like to welcome you to Creepy Confidential. I'm your host, Noelle, your resident weirdo Wisconsinite. I open case files on my favorite cryptids, cults, conspiracies, and other worldly creepy, with new cases, live broadcasts, and local lore. Some stories have been lost with time. Others are perhaps still happening today in your local communities, right up under your very creepy noses. So get ready, creeps. It's Creepy Confidential. Sup, creeps. Today's episode is going to cover some graphic, creepy, tragic history. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most tragic and creepy historical moments in our nation's soil. The tale of families trying to pioneer their way over to the West Coast for a new beginning. Between bad luck and bad choices, the Donner Party never stood a chance. April 15th, 1846, 89 people and 20 wagons started their journey and went into the severe Nevada mountains. Only 45 came out by the time of the last rescue in the late winter, almost early spring of 1847. The Donner Party tragedy solidified their story into the creepy history books forever. large amounts of families were migrating their way to the west via the Oregon Trail. Attacks by natives, hunger, and loneliness were only a few hazards that parties suffered with their long journey across the United States. Families were willing to endure and didn't even 100% know what they would find at the end of their journey. George Donner and his brother Jacob had made their life in Springfield, Illinois, and were in their 60s when they decided to make the journey west. George Donner met James Reed, but no one is quite sure how that meeting came to be, how those two men came to be in each other's company. Reed was a prosperous businessman who had invested big in the railroad, but when that went bust, he ended up having to rob Peter to pay Paul, sort of when it came to paying his bills, and was ready for a fresh start. He filed bankruptcy, and his local lawyer was helping him get ready to liquefy whatever assets he might have had left. He liked this lawyer well enough that he asked him to join their party and their journey. A tall, gangly fella who was 2 years away from being a congressman and 15 years away from being the President of the United States of America. Let's see if you put that all together. Tall, gangly, fellow from Illinois, living in Illinois, who was a congressman and then a president. None other than Abraham Lincoln. That's right, folks. The 16th president of the United States of America could have been part of the Donner Party and potentially either a victim of cannibalism or took part of cannibalism. Sadly, his fate could not be outrun, though, as we all know what happened to him that night in the theater. R.I.P., sir. Back to the Donners. So the Donner-Reed party was trying to get going. The leaders of this party had land fever, and they really wanted to make a new and warmer start in California. They had come across this book, The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California by Lansford Hastings. The book claimed to contain a description of the different routes to those countries, or so they were called back then, and all necessary information relative to the equipment, supplies, and the method of traveling, per the title of the book. I know, that's a lot, but that was indeed the whole title. For the listeners, if you decide you want to take a look at this book, you can go to archive.org, and they actually have a scanned-in copy of this book. I believe it's at 158 pages, so there is quite a bit to it, but I also found references where they called it a pamphlet. So that's a big pamphlet. But if you want to see it, archive.org has it for free, a version of it that you can see for free. What's wild to me is that much of this information in this book seems like it could be useful, but the part that makes us hate Hastings in the end will come later. The party needed to leave Illinois by the second week of March and reach Independence, Missouri by April 1st. But they didn't leave Illinois until April 14th. Which from the very beginning made them more than a month behind, which may not seem like a big deal nowadays, but trying to literally go over the mountain in snow or not in snow makes a huge difference. Especially when you only have ox, a wagon, and your whole household in those wagons. So what held them back so late? Remember Reed? He's still trying to get his affairs in order and has to wait to sign the paperwork until April 13th. The rest of the day, he was trying to smuggle goods to kind of get ready for his trip. So they didn't leave until the 14th. One person made them start that late. When they made it to Independence, the other groups that were headed west had already left, having spent a week recharging their energy and, more importantly, recharging the energy of their oxen. The party quickly realized why it was important to get there earlier. Now, before I go on, one quick thought was that if they knew at this time that clearly this was too late and only, 2 weeks of a journey so far, go back. go back to Illinois. But, they didn't, or that's what history tells us. The first setback was when they got to the Big Blue River after they had left Independence. The river, with another large team that they had met up with, they noticed that the river had swelled. Then they stopped at the banks to try and figure out what they might do. And the river had just almost doubled in size because of the late spring rains, and snow melt off had just made it really, really rise. The best time to cross would have been a month earlier. While they were waiting 4 days for the water level to try and go down a little bit, they lost the first member of their party. Don't worry, not to cannibalism, at least not yet. Mrs. Reed's elderly mother passed away. She was buried. They made a coffin for her. They buried her right there on the trail. The river never dropped at all in its level, and they knew they had to make a choice. The men of the party chopped down trees, and they helped create these rafts to help them sail these wagons across the river. That night, the temperature dropped, and it began to rain. But on June 1st, they were able to resume their journey. Now, with 5 more days lost, they knew they could still make it as long as nothing else went wrong. Famous last words, right? June 27th, 1846. The Donner Reed party and the large party that they were traveling with arrives at Fort Laramie. Now, James Reed meets up with this kind of mountaineer man named James Clyman, who had just come by horse with Lansford Hastings by way of this new route known as the Hastings Cutoff. So if you are keeping track, the book Hastings wrote included this route. So how can he write the route and tell the people to take it as a way to cut off time and distance if he only now has taken this route? If your spidey senses are tingling, you are correct. So Clyman urges the Donner Reed party to avoid this cutoff and to stay on the normal trail that would connect to the Oregon Trail, which is vastly more known and trusted. Because at this point, lots of people had been traveling via that route. Further on the journey at Independence Rock, a rider bearing an open letter from Hastings urging, quote, all immigrants now on the road, quote, to meet them at Fort Bridger, so that he can guide them on his cutoff. They continued, and on July 19th, reached the fork in the road. One way to the Oregon Trail, and the other to the Hastings Cutoff. They turned left to the shortcut. This cutoff would end up adding 125 miles to their journey, and weeks of time on the trail. At this turn, the leader would shift, and it would become the Donner Party. In the later afternoons and evenings, they noticed the weather shifting, and chilling temperatures and winds were starting. July 27th, they arrived at Fort Bridger, and they raced ahead to meet the then famous Lansford Hastings. But Hastings wasn't there. He had left with previous impatient settlers wanting to move on. They stayed 3 days there at the fort. 11 days before the Donner Party arrived, it had rained. When the clouds from the rainstorm broke, it revealed snow on the mountains, and then temperatures had dropped from the 80s to the 40s. Winter was knocking at the door, and hard. Others in the train were very worried about the shift in the weather. Another guide discouraged them from taking the cutoff. The smaller group had ridden ahead and wrote the wagon party detailed instructions, again to go around and not take the cutoff, but the notes of caution never reached the party. James Reed wrote to a friend that he expected the road to be level and was excited that the cutoff took hundreds of miles off the trail. As they continued on, and soon were met with more bad circumstances. An ox had been lost, and the road was not smooth as promised. They had to ride over hills and valleys, and Hastings had secured a note to a sage bush, of all things. He wrote they should send a party ahead to help guide them. There were trees and brush all throughout, so not very passable for wagons and people to just easily move through them. They reached Hastings, and they demanded that he ride back with them and guide them. Partway into the journey, he quits the mission. Douchebag Award of the Year. He explained he needed to return to his other caravan and that the best he could do was lead James Reed to a peak called Big Mountain, east of Salt Lake. At the Big Mountain, he only gave vague instructions and then straight up bailed. They would never see him again. Reed returned to the party and gave them another trail. Another family, the Graves family, joined up with the Donner family to join them in the last portion of the journey. For those who know how the story ends, that was a major bad decision on the Graves' part. Now, the entirety of the parties headed to the Salt Lake Desert. End of August, Luke Halloran died of tuberculosis. He was buried at the fork in the road. Another note was found from Hastings warning them of another 2-day drive ahead. So they collect grass from their animals and water for them. And 3 days into this 2-day journey, they run out of water. They experience mirages, and a set of oxen stampede and run off in search of water, never to be seen again. 5 days into their 2-day journey, thanks again, Hastings, they finished the harrowing crossing of the desert. They had lost 36 head of cattle, and 4 wagons had to be abandoned. They found a water source, but they discovered they didn't have enough food to make it to California. They set back out on September 10th, and 6 days later, they experienced a snowstorm. This was Mother Nature's first take to let them know of their snowy future. Early October, while struggling up a sandy hill at Iron Point, Nevada, the teams became entangled. A fight breaks out, and Reed is hit on the head by a man named John Snyder. The fight continues. Reed's wife gets hit on the head. I'm not sure if it's by accident or on purpose, by Snyder, and Reed stabs Snyder and kills him. For this, he is exiled. Now, I understand that they are trying to kind of have justice and maintain morale and rules, but clearly this trip is already not going correctly, and now you're going to exile somebody. But in the future, it would turn out that might actually have helped them. So he's exiled with nothing but clothes and a horse. Luckily, his daughter sneaks out and brings him his arm, his gun, his knife, some provisions that some that they still had. So at least he had a chance. Back on the road, right? The next day, another incident. An elderly man in the party is turned out of his wagon trying to lighten the load as everyone who can walk is walking. They've pretty much walked this whole time just to try and save the strength. More weight is going to slow them down and cause more wear and tear on their oxen. So they turn out this old man, and nobody else wants to take him in. And he is last seen sitting by the side of a road because he cannot go any further. October 11th, 1846. At night, Paiute Indians kill 21 of the Donner's oxen. Another 18 of the oxen are taken, and several others are wounded. I don't know if you creeps are catching a trend here, but this poor party of pioneers just could not catch a break and, or just make a good decision, really. So moving on, it was the last week of October, and winter was already starting to set in. Now, if you're keeping tabs again or know the story, this is when things really start to descend into the pit of despair. The cold, The snow and depleted food sources have caught up with the traveling party, and things are about to go from bad to worst circumstances imaginable. On Halloween night, they reach Truckee Lake. They went around the north side and discovered a small cabin, we'll call it. It's kind of more just a storage area. They fed their hungry cattle, cut pieces of pine branches, because the snow was covering everything else, so they couldn't eat off of the ground. That night, they camped and slept under a clear sky and a full moon. They noticed a halo, which told these Midwest farmers a storm was approaching. And the next morning, the snow began to fall. The snow began to fall so hard, it buried the wagons almost up to the axles, and they had to make a decision to abandon the wagons altogether. They turned back to lower elevation to that little abandoned cabin that they had crossed earlier. They just could not go any further. They had traveled 2,500 miles and were only 100 miles from the next big fort. But it might as well have been another 1,000 miles. The most demoralizing part was that they had missed their window by 1 day because of the snowstorm. 1 day. And they would have been ahead of this big snowstorm. All the late starts, random delays, fights, and choosing the Hastings cutoff, they would have made it. So now they're stuck. The snow had hit. The next day, they tried once more to advance, but after a mile or so, they had to turn back. The snow was so heavy. That night, they have to kill the last of their cattle for hides to cover the tops of the shack and the meat to eat. It snowed heavy for 8 straight days, keeping them from building additional cabins that would have been needed to be kind of sustainable somehow over the winter. They knew they would be there until the snow broke. As the winter moved forward, they bartered the last of their sickly animals amongst each other, with only a small celebration when they managed to kill a bear, only after the bear almost killed them. Then the exiled Reed and 2 others had made it to the other side. In the history books, we learn that the exiled Reed and 2 others, traveling companions, we'll call it, they weren't from the party, obviously, had made it to the other side of the mountains. They assembled food and fresh animals and started back on a rescue mission. Reed and his traveling companions had come across a couple, the Curtises, that had left the larger party earlier on, based on a disagreement, and they joined the couple for a meal. When they were scooped a portion out of a Dutch oven, for a meal, they had no idea that it was the couple's pet dog that they were eating. They promised that they would come back for them once they had found and rescued the Donner Party. They continued, and the snow hammered down. At one point, the only thing visible was the neck of the horses. The snow was too soft and deep. They had to turn back. They dug the horses out and returned to the couple at the campsite, and then returned to the fort. Meanwhile, back at the campsite, the Donner Party were now resorting to eating bark, and the occasional lucky hit, like a mangy timber wolf, if they managed to get lucky. The small amounts of meat and fat were given first to the children and the elderly. One of the party, Stanton, last name Stanton, decided that they could make snowshoes to try and get across the snow. December 15th, the first recorded death in the camps occur. A young man dies of malnutrition. Later that day, Jacob Donner passes, along with 2 other men. On December 16th, after there was a break in the snow, a group of 17 men, women, and children leave the main camp with 8 pounds of dried beef, a little sugar, and coffee. Possibly enough to stay alive for 6 days. One man, Stanton, got horrible snow blindness, swollen eyes, blind, and unable to move forward on his own. He was seen smoking his pipe and was asked by one of the younger folk in the crew there if he was okay, and he told them he would be along shortly. The small party departed, and Stanton was never seen again. Meanwhile, back at the main camp, 3-year-old Eliza said that they captured and ate little field mice that had crept into the camp. The scrap pieces of beef hide were scraped and boiled until it was the consistency of glue, and then swallowed the best that they could. Bones that had no more marrow were burned and eaten. Pine scraps were consumed to try and curb their hunger and get some nutrition. The snowshoe crew continued wandering through the snow like zombies. Patrick Dolland was the first to think the unthinkable and said they should draw sticks or lots to see who would sacrifice themselves first. They drew lots to duel. Dollard drew the shortest. Ouch. But they ended up not following through with it, but their status as a group rapidly deteriorated. Another man in the party, Franklin Grave, died shortly after a large gust blew out their fire. So he probably just that little bit of warmth was what was helping him hang on. But before he expired, he begged that they should eat him to survive. Dolan woke up the camp Christmas morning, shrieking and screaming, suffering from hypothermia. He was delirious. They managed to calm him down, and he fell into a deep sleep and never woke up. They were finally able to get a rolling fire from a large pine. The rule was that no one would have to consume a relative. Even in times of desperation, a moral compass was present. They were just trying to survive and not be savages. A young man, just 13 years old, had become delirious, just was so hungry, and he ate a whole mouse alive. With his delirium increasing after having to know what he did, he laid on his sister's lap and just passed away. December 30th, they left the now labeled camp, which is now known as the Camp of Death, and their journey continued on with blood tracing in the snow. Their feet had been bloodied just because of all of this horrible, it's wet, it's cold, they're not able to go, and now it's passing through their moccasins. New Year's Eve, they ate the last of the human meat. Patrick Breen's diary read, "Last of the year. May we, with God's help, spend the coming year better than the past, which we purpose to do if Almighty God will deliver us from our present dreadful situation, which is our prayer if the will of God sees it fitting for us. Amen." The snowshoers continue and come across a bloodied trail. They find the 2 natives that had been traveling with the larger group, but they had left due to a growing concern that they themselves would find themselves as part of a hate crime and possibly a meal. Now they were laying prone on the ground at the base of a tree, out of energy and unable to continue walking. The women moved out of the way, and then 2 men shot them in the head with a rifle. The nutrition gained from their corpses was enough energy to allow them to find an Indian trail 2 days later. Ironically enough, the same tribe that the 2 men that had been consumed were part of. The natives, not knowing this information, nursed the party back to health, and some of them were taken to a couple's house nearby. 17 snowshoers had left the original camp to try and find help. Now only 2 men and 5 women remained of that group. Back at the main area, the Truckee Lake camp, the conditions were deplorable. January 31st, 1847, the first relief party was able to leave Sutter's Fort. February 19th, the rescue party makes it to the camp. It's quiet. so quiet they are unsure if anybody is even there. Then a skeletal woman emerged from the hole in the snow. She asked, "Are you men from California, or are you from heaven?" She believed these men were possibly a mirage. 9 members of the lake camp were dead, and a baby had succumbed to death the night the rescuers arrived. How a baby could have made it this long, and I'm sure there were other babies, just due to the cold and the nutrition, is a miracle, in my opinion. The rescuers doled out food very carefully, knowing that with starvation, if they ate too fast, they potentially could kill them. Not all of the party could be rescued in one go. They knew they were going to have to do this in a few groupings. They took a section of the stranded and knew they would have to return for them in a week. In between rescue missions, the camp went from bad to worst case scenario. When they returned, dismembered corpses and body parts were strewn everywhere. The children of Donner sat on a nearby log eating the heart of their father, blood staining their cheeks and chin. They completely ignored the rescuers. Around the campfire were fragments of bone and skin. Mr. Reed was with his rescue party and discovered his faithful wagon driver. His head and face had not been touched, but the rest of him had. The rescue mission was not the last. The 3rd and 4th mission returned. They found a kettle. Inside was human skin. The rescuers found the last survivor, Louis Keysburg. In his room, they found a pan of water that contained a fresh liver and lungs. He had eaten Tamsin Donner, George Donner's wife, even though he swore he did not take her life. He was the last to be rescued. 81 people made it to those mountains. 45 of them survived. Most were physically scarred from frostbite and malnutrition afterwards. All were emotionally scarred and what they had to do to survive. For about 8 months, the stories of this horrible tale shocked people in all of the kind of media outlets into not attempting the journey. But after all this horror, Sutter and his business partner had started a business and accidentally started the gold rush after discovering the flakes while they were building the business that they had recently began. With the people shifting from land fever to gold fever after that. So what about Hastings? That was what I wanted to know at the end of this tale. Did karma catch up to him? Ultimately, yes, but not in the way I maybe had hoped during this story, kind of unraveling all of the pieces. I really wanted to hear justice was served by the people of the Donner Party, but that was not what happened. After California was conquered by the United States, his chances of that empire, of being the top dog and ruling that area, had crumbled. He served as the territorial judge to Yuma, Arizona, after his family moved there in the 1850s. During the Civil War, he sided with the South, and he was promoted to rank of major in the Confederate States Army. He died in St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands in 1870, possibly due to yellow fever. So if we're lucky, it wasn't fun for him. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Slightly different than usual, but history lessons can have a creepy side too. So thanks for coming to class. Before I wrap up today, I want to thank the Creep Nation for making 2024 a great year. More episodes, more listeners, and our first convention. This was our last episode for the year, and we look forward to seeing you all next year. We will be starting the year off with some fun episodes, and the live streams will be back. Join us January 17th, 2025, for if you're listening to this in the way future, over on our YouTube channel. We will be welcoming Leslie and Stephen Shaw to come and talk about their book and the cool things that they know about. All of our links are in the episode details for that episode, as well as all of our other ones in the past. Until next year, we'll catch you right here on Creepy Confidential.
Hey, I'm Gina.
And I'm Amber.
And we are here to bring you the Weird True Crime Podcast, where we cover true crime cases that will leave you asking yourself, did that really happen?
We'll dive into well-known and not-so-known cases throughout history. Some are unsolved and some are just unbelievable.
We'll also talk about current news topics that range from kooky to questionable on episodes that we like to call Weird Headlines.
Be sure to subscribe and listen on your favorite podcast service.
On Wiki Travel, the Pacific Northwest is best known for its beautiful coastline, green interior, rainy weather, and spectacular mountains. But because of all this, it's also the perfect place to go missing. My name's Carmita, and I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in Portland, Oregon. I host a podcast called Missing in the PNW. My podcast is different from others you may have heard because I focus specifically on two things. The first is that all of the missing person cases that I cover are strictly from the Pacific Northwest and Oregon and Washington. I know, the title of my podcast should have given that one away. The second thing is that my podcast focuses strictly on missing persons from marginalized communities, such as the Black, Hispanic, Native American and Indigenous people, and the LGBTQ plus communities. You know, the ones that get absolutely no media attention. Now, I am not an investigative journalist or a reporter. I'm actually a widowed mom of 3 who loves true crime and has a passion for social justice. So join me in helping to spread the word on these missing person cases and help be the voice for the ones that are now voiceless. You can find Missing in the PNW on all of the major streaming apps, as well as on socials at Missing in the PNW Podcast. If you have a case you want me to cover, please email me at missinginthepnw@gmail.com or send me a message through Facebook Messenger. I hope to talk to you soon. And remember, have fun, but be safe.